Hello and welcome to the second UlyssesNeuro Podcast. My name is Carolina De Pasquale, and here with me today, although remotely, are Caroline Ruth.
Hi there.
Hi, she's an educational psychologist and completing a doctorate on Fragile X in UCD. And Maria Panza.
Hi, everybody.
She's the chairperson of Fragile X Ireland. And from our lab are John Kealy.
Hello.
Charlotte Callaghan.
Hi.
And Fabiana Traini.
Hi there.
And Massimiliano Bianchi. Hi, Max.
Hey, hi everybody.
And so the topics of discussion today are Autism Awareness Month, which is April, so we're talking about it now, and Fragile X syndrome in Ireland, and obviously the research projects that people in the podcast are involved in. So Caroline, could you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm an educational psychologist and I work as part of the Carlow Kilkenny Developmental and Autism Psychology team. It's the 0 to 18 team and I work in a multidisciplinary clinic. I'm currently completing a professional doctorate in UCD, as you said, and I'm conducting a research study on the support needs of families with a child with a diagnosis of Fragile X syndrome in Ireland. I suppose, to put it in context, a lot of international research is focused primarily on causes and characteristics, developmental outcomes, available interventions and impact on the family. But I suppose there's a significant lack of research on the support needs of families affected. And furthermore, from an Irish context on Fragile X, research on Fragile X is particularly limited, and that renders it misunderstood and potentially misdiagnosed and underdiagnosed despite new cases emerging every year. So I suppose my study aims to address the research gap by examining the profile of families affected in Ireland, their support needs and predictors of those needs. And I suppose there's a particular focus on the voice of parents and on their lived experience of Fragile X. So I'm hoping that my research findings will be used in some way to inform policy and practice within the Irish context, and in particular to enhance understanding about this complex disorder. And I guess being an educational psychologist, I have a particular interest on the psychosocial and educational support needs of these families. And I'm hoping that my research will go some way to help tailor educational and psychological services and to enhance awareness and knowledge to best meet these families' needs.
That's fantastic, and it's really needed work. It's quite different from what we usually work on. Max, can you explain what the middle ground between us is?
Yeah, Carolina. So, as Ulysses Neuroscience, we decided to go into research in autism spectrum disorder as well as neurodevelopmental disorder. So, as you mentioned before, is the Autism Awareness Day, which is very, very important. And autism is a disorder on which we are clearly interested, and we are doing some research on it. But it's also important to stress in here, and I think then probably Maria will say a few words, and when she will talk about it, that there is also something wrong in the way in which autism spectrum disorders are actually diagnosed, and it looks so far to me that it's a big open box where a lot of disorders are put in. And Fragile X disorder has to be considered, in my opinion, a standalone neurodevelopmental disorder, which is quite different from autism, to be honest with you. And at least this is my opinion. So our interest in neurodevelopmental disorders includes disorders which are called X-linked brain disorder. So those are disorders where they are caused by a mutation on the X chromosome, which is a chromosome that we all have. It's a chromosome that actually decides the gender. So females have 2 X chromosomes, while males have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. So in between the disorders and the mutation on the X chromosome, we are interested in Fragile X, and this is the reason of this podcast. And we're also very much interested in another disorder, which we will talk about in a future podcast, which is called CDKL5 deficiency disorder. Also, what I would like to point out is that as Ulysses Neuroscience and as a private R&D company, we do believe very much to have a social responsibility. And indeed, one of our core values is to be patient-centric, and it's very important for us to talk with families and to talk with patients when this is possible to drive our research in the right direction. So, I'm very pleased to have Maria here with us and to have Caroline here with us as well. And maybe Charlotte, who is Patient Insight Manager at Ulysses Neuroscience, wants to add a few words about that.
Yeah, thanks, Max. So, my role as Patient Insight Manager
in Ulysses is really sort of to reach out to the communities and families and patient groups that we work with. So, and to speak to them about their experience with the different diseases or disorders that we are researching, and to understand more about what worries them and what the symptoms of diseases are that really that they feel there needs to be more focus on, or that they feel more attention needs to be put towards. And through speaking then with the families and the patients, we can gather information that really helps to inform our research and to direct it in a way that we feel is going to be most beneficial to patients down the line. And so it's really an honor to have Caroline and Maria here today. And so maybe Maria can introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the Fragile X Society in Ireland, and take it from there, I guess.
Okay, well, I've been the voluntary chair of the Irish Fragile X Society for about 10 years now, and I became involved shortly after my daughter's diagnosis. So she was diagnosed first with autism, and then we discovered that the genetic cause of her autism behaviors was the Fragile X gene. When she was diagnosed, we were still under the DSM-4, but now with DSM-5, Fragile X is actually a comorbid disorder of autism. So you can have Fragile X alone, or you can have Fragile X autism as a comorbid disorder. Usually the individuals with the comorbid disorder are with Fragile X and autism are usually more affected. Well, obviously with autism is only a behavioral disorder. Fragile X tells you a little bit more because it's about biology, and thanks to Fragile X, the neurobiology of Fragile X, we understand more about the causes or the whys of why we see certain behaviors in autism. Because it's, well, still even 10 years on, what my big mission was to take out the fragile what, which was usually greeted with me. I mean, I think it's a little bit better known, but still 10 years on, it's still fragile, huh? Even in a decade, we still need to work better on awareness. Yeah, take away the fear factor out of genetics, because we have learned so much from genetics.
Yeah, Maria, you mentioned the word awareness, and this is what your society is doing. And I do believe that awareness in our community concerning disorders like Fragile X is very important. So, do you think there is enough awareness at the moment in the community about the disorder, and how can this be addressed? And I think Caroline can also comment on that.
Even as a Fragile X carrier, we have more awareness now. We understand that the various health conditions that are associated with being a Fragile X carrier, but still, even as I go to different appointments, and even so now, at first when I started this journey, it was really advocating for my daughter, but now I'm advocating a lot for myself as Fragile X carrier. And still in health settings, yes, I'm usually greeted with, I remember studying a chapter on that in school, but that's it. And I don't know why I don't know. I suppose when people, maybe even if we think of it in the autism setting, we just look at the behaviors. We don't go enough into why. And it's a Band-Aid approach, even in the we fix what we see first, rather than going deeper into the why of neurobiology, the why of endocrinology, that we just, I don't think, maybe this is my little research brain, where, and like a scientist, that you explore and you explore and you explore and you go, and that's, I don't think we have enough of that passion in the community generally, in wanting to know the whys and how, because when we know why, we know how we can help.
And if I could, just following on from what you were saying, Maria, and to answer your question, Max, around the awareness that's out there of Fragile X, I would completely agree with Maria. And I suppose, relatively speaking, this is quite a new diagnosis, and it was only since the early 90s that we've discovered so much more, since Fragile X was actually discovered. But even a couple of decades on, the awareness out there is very low, and I think, like, a lot of research would support that, and it like a lot of the research would say that lack of knowledge, and therefore that recognition, like, that's considered extant amongst healthcare professionals, according to research, and that does pose a major obstacle to early identification. And I think for me, working as a psychologist on a multidisciplinary team, I could certainly endorse that to a lot of us, and this is no disrespect to anyone, Fragile X is a diagnosis on a page of a child that comes in probably rarely enough into the clinics, but perhaps is becoming more common. But a lot of my colleagues would say and are very supportive of my research. My own psychology manager, the multidisciplinary team are very supportive, and they're very keen to learn the findings from my research and to learn more about Fragile X. And even my local pediatric team in the hospital, they're all very supportive of my research, and they're all aware of it. So I think it's not to be aspirational that I think my research is going to make any huge difference, but I think realistically, starting at a local level, if I can start to spread that knowledge and awareness amongst healthcare professionals, because I suppose for a lot of us, we're at the front line of identifying children in early intervention that have difficulties at an early age. So that's what I would certainly aspire to do, for that knowledge to kind of increase that knowledge base at a local level to start with. And I suppose even just a cursory analysis of some of my data so far has definitely exposed that a lot of parents would say that there is such a lack of knowledge and awareness out there, and that has become really isolating to them.
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. And I was actually thinking, that maybe for the audience that is with us today, maybe we can just explain a little bit more about the biology with simple terms of Fragile X, and also explain, because we use the word, carrier. What is a carrier? And then what is a Fragile X, a real Fragile X patient? And another point that I would like to underline, and it's very important, what you say is early intervention. This is fundamental for neurodevelopmental disorders like Fragile X. So I do agree completely with you. So maybe, John, what about you? You talk a little bit in simple terms about the biology of Fragile X, and explain also the difference between a carrier and the patient.
Sure. So Maria has already mentioned that she is a carrier, and that her daughter is a patient with Fragile X syndrome. So Fragile X is, and actually it's funny that she mentioned that, there's a chapter we looked at in a book years ago. As a scientist and a neuroscientist, it's something that I very rarely came across in books, and usually it was just a footnote as an example of what an X-linked disorder might be. So an X-linked disorder is one carried on the X chromosome, e.g. Fragile X syndrome, and that's pretty much it. That's what you'd find in undergraduate textbooks. So basically it's a mutation in a particular gene associated with Fragile X syndrome, whereby, without getting too much into detail, at the beginning of any particular gene, and a gene is just a piece of DNA that codes for a particular protein. At the beginning of any particular gene, you have a little sequence which acts as kind of like a guide for the machinery of the cell to attach to, and then to transcribe the DNA and turn it into a protein. So this will vary with different genes, and it will vary within the same gene between different individuals as well. And at the beginning of this particular gene, you have a little triplet of nucleotide base pairs, CGG. Doesn't really matter what they are, but they're there, and they're repeated, CGG, 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 CGG. And you can have a few of those repeats at the beginning of your gene, and that's perfectly fine. The problem is that these repeats can have a tendency to multiply. So between 5 and 40 would be normal, but then you could have between 50 and 200 repeats. But it's when you start getting even higher amounts of repeats that you get this kind of catastrophic kind of amount building up. So more than 200 is typically what we'd see in patients with Fragile X syndrome. And what this means is that you basically have a huge big loop of DNA at the beginning of your gene, which normally wouldn't be there. And the cellular biology then has a problem attaching to that and efficiently producing the protein that is meant to. If you imagine, it's like a sewing machine where you gather up too much material before you start to stitch. It'll just bunch up and jam. And this is kind of what we see in Fragile X syndrome. And then as a result, the protein that should be produced isn't produced quite as well. And the knock-on effect for that is, so this protein that's produced by the Fragile X gene is normally used to help make other proteins in the cell. And so once this isn't there in the right amount of numbers, you get a knock-on effect in production of other proteins within the cell. And this then has a knock-on effect from a physiological level, because you then get neurons and other parts of the body and other cells in the body as well, but particularly neurons in this disorder, that are now not producing enough proteins to make new connections with each other in the brain and to maintain those connections. So you get this synaptic effect where the connections between neurons become affected. So that's basically from me, a molecular biologist kind of physiology point of view, kind of where I come from in understanding this. So hearing Caroline's perspective and Maria's perspective, where we're talking about the families, the clinical and the behavioral aspects of it in actual patients, is hugely important for us to kind of to fill in the gaps between what we know about the gene at a molecular level and what we know about the disorder at an actual functional day-to-day level.
The way I think of that protein, though, is that the brakes are taken off. So that basically that protein, like, well, as we know, it's important for everybody, and we know that it's found in all individuals. So that's where we have to be mindful of that everybody has the Fragile X gene. Everybody has this protein. Okay, for some people, the gene, as you said, it expands. There's an average length. I wouldn't call it normal. I'd say an average length. And then it repeats, the DNA sequence can go to an intermediate level and then a carrier level. And then, for a diagnosis of Fragile X, we need the CGG repeat sequence to go to over 200, because that's when we see that it affects the protein. So which takes the brakes off. That's the way I like to think of it, though. And that's when you see the sensory processing difficulties in individuals with Fragile X.
And this actually, no worries. I mean, this actually brings us to discuss a little about the symptomatology of the Fragile X, because it's very variable. That's what we understood. It can be from very mild to very severe, and includes sensory processing, which you have mentioned, and a severe anxiety, which is a very important component of a Fragile X. And what people define also as autism behavior is included into that. Now, you see, talking with you is for us very important, because we know about the symptomatology from the textbooks. We know from the symptomatology by talking with pharmaceutical companies, which do work with us to develop new treatments for Fragile X. And their interest in certain endpoints, certain particular endpoints that they want to see or to verify if their drugs have effects on. And but sometimes when we discuss them with the families, we don't find much kind of correlation between what we have in the textbooks or our discussions with the pharma company. So I would be interested, to know from you as a parent, do you think that the symptomatology we find in textbooks do really reflect what is in the real world?
Yeah. Okay. For parents, from a parent perspective, the first thing that a parent will do when they get a diagnosis is that they will they will Google their lives away, and they will see some shocking images. They don't see the pretty pictures. And that's what even the Fragile X community were so conscious of making sure that, our children are children. That's it. I don't know why that there was this shock effect and it was really, for me now, when I look back at it, those images were really, really vulnerable people where we were in a time when we really didn't respect individuals with intellectual disabilities, when they were outcast from society and stuff. So the images, the old images aren't great. The modern images of very, very happy children with Fragile X are heartwarming, thank God, that more people, families realized that they needed to share these beautiful children too. Now, these beautiful children do grow up to be adults. And if, like we said, back to the early intervention, if we don't give these individuals early intervention, that's when we lose them. So we really focus so much on early intervention with individuals with Fragile X. We have to do it. But sadly, there's late diagnosis that we have to contend with too. And then we spend our lives catching up. Those people who didn't get that early intervention, there's a lot of catching up to do, and they spend their lives catching up, which is hard. I think if everybody, even if from birth, if people were diagnosed with Fragile X, they'd stand a better chance, and just understanding, because you can't battle with neurobiology, but there's so many support therapies and strategies that you can use to help these individuals be the best that they can be.
And on that note, Maria, has diagnosis, do you know from talking to families, has it improved in recent years at all with the availability of? No, not at all.
No, not at all. In fact, I'm meeting more people, maybe with awareness. Now, sometimes I'm meeting individuals in their 20s who are being diagnosed with Fragile X, or people in their teens, like kids I was like, how is this happening that, that we can have teenagers just diagnosed? They thought they were dealing maybe because they were mildly, because it's a range of, from mild to severe. So the mild, sometimes some of the children who are mildly affected were diagnosed with Asperger's. So they were missed. And then depending on environment too, you can have, sadly, I've seen Fragile X carriers in the wrong environment also, with not getting intervention, because nobody is immune from this gene. Like I said, everybody has this gene, so it just depends on, there's environmental factors that we need to consider too, as well as biology as well. Sorry.
And just to add to that, I think to add to the complexity of the diagnosis of Fragile X is the fact that the expression of it varies in accordance with a number of individual factors, such as the gene mutation status, the gender, the presence and severity of an intellectual disability, and the presence of autism or ADHD. So there are so many variables, across individuals, which really adds to that complexity. And I think as well the fact that girls are less severely affected in most cases by Fragile X. There's a lack of research really around the presentation of Fragile X in girls. And even for my own research, I certainly didn't get as many families of girls of Fragile X participating. And perhaps that's because of their lack of need for support services or to be linked in with something such as the Fragile X Society, because the needs maybe aren't as prevalent. But it really does add to the complexity, the fact that there are so many variables within this disorder.
And research has identified that there's too many girls that are falling between the cracks. They're out there, but we don't know where. But they're very, very vulnerable too, and they do need a lot of support. But they're missed. The girls with Fragile X are missed. My daughter happens to have a dual diagnosis of Fragile X autism. Like I said, they're usually individuals that present more affected, if you like. So she was caught early at 2, but there's so many girls that are missed, and that's just going to cause problems later on in life too.
Is the reason that so many girls are missed because obviously women will have backup copy of any gene on the X chromosome, and so are their symptoms milder, that they tend to get an alternative diagnosis, that it might look like an anxiety disorder or an autism disorder?
Yes, it does often look like anxiety. Yeah, so if you think back to what Max was saying, back to the XX identifies females, and yes, the other X can compensate for, if you like, the Fragile X. So those girls, but yet, yes, we see anxiety a lot. So anxiety maybe in teenage years, but then, they're just, rather than really understanding their biology, we just look at the anxiety rather than understanding.
And I think the fact that the physical features, isn't it, Maria, that are more apparent in kind of maybe prepubescent or adolescent boys, that they're more obvious and perhaps less obvious in the girls as well. And not that you could ever rely on the physical features alone, but it's just an added complexity in the diagnosis of girls.
Yeah, actually, even in the what is that? The hypermobility. Oh, what's it called? There's a disorder. Oh. Yeah, it's ED,
Ehlers-Danlos syndrome.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So even I've seen some of that community too with the hypermobility, which is a core feature of Fragile X. But then sometimes, hypermobility. I know some individuals that it doesn't appear, but more than likely hypermobility appears. So that could just be hypermobility could be addressed rather than going in deeper into the biology of why are we seeing hypermobility. Could we explore genetics more when we see if hypermobility presents? But we don't. So that could be there's a couple of key points. I wouldn't focus so much on the physical, which is probably what was happening before, because if you think any of the literature just suggests these large ears and a long face, that's too limiting to see that. So I wouldn't. Yeah, the old literature really focuses on that. So I think we limit ourselves if we just focus on at the same time, we don't have, with the Down syndrome community, individuals with Down syndrome, it's so obvious from birth. And Fragile X, maybe if we see more people with Fragile X, we'd see it from birth too. With hypermobility, if we were looking for that. because I really believe my daughter presented at birth. Well, she did present at birth, but I think it was obvious from birth, her diagnosis. I'm convinced it was obvious at birth because they were, what is it called? It's hip dysplasia. And the doctors kept, they could see that she was hypermobile, but they were just focused on that hip. I think it's called hip dysplasia now. I'm not far from medical. I think it's called that.
That's right. Yeah.
Whatever that's, yeah. And they kept testing her for that. But you see, they were limited. They were just going, okay, these are our checks. So, but she doesn't have that. But instead going, oh, she's definitely hypermobile. There's something else going on. But it was just, okay, she doesn't have that. And then move on. But maybe if we could have explored that more.
Yeah. And I think, Maria, isn't it, it's again, another barrier is the fact that there's no simple screening tool that's specific to Fragile X. There are screening tools that are used for over 24 months, but what we want is that early identification that is so important when the brain is so plastic and we can get the early intervention in place. So I think it's very limiting and prohibitive, the fact that there isn't, a specific screening tool that can be used effectively in early identification. There is one that I've come across that that I was very interested in, I suppose, based on my own work on the multidisciplinary team. It's called the BIPSI FX. I don't know if you've come across it, but that's basically a parent questionnaire and a screener. And that's in reliability studies, that's showing some very promising results of being able to identify Fragile X. It's a screener that can be used by, by healthcare professionals or by parents themselves from an early age, that might help identify children that are at risk for Fragile X and that may need to go on for further genetic testing. So that's something that's quite hopeful, I think. And I suppose it's the behaviourist in me as well, and maybe the educational psychologist in me that is really hopeful about something like that. And it's a screener like that could be pivotal in helping to spread the knowledge and awareness on early intervention teams.
But even developmental milestones, when they're not met, developmental milestones were identified. Okay, it's for the majority of, but if they're not met, there's a reason for that too. They can't be, it's not just a character. Developmental milestones, there's something going on if developmental milestones aren't met. And I think that's not taken seriously enough too. Maybe because of an overburdened health system that we have, but if developmental milestones aren't met, we need to address that fast.
I think part of the problem is also, as you say, an overwhelmed health system, that the waiting lists for people referred to when they don't meet these milestones to be referred to somebody like Caroline are too long. And even if they do get to see somebody like Caroline, that they are told you need to get a genetic test. The genetic counselling, genetic services in Ireland is practically non-existent. So I think there is a not just for Fragile X, but for rare genetic disorders as a whole, there needs to be a lot more done and a lot more at a systemic level to see this to move this forward to help patients, because for any of these disorders, early intervention is key. Whether it's the psychological aspects or even the physical, like that. Like, I mean, a lot of patients will need OT and speech and language therapy, and we're not getting there in time. And we can't say we're ignorant of it. We know that the developmental window is narrow, and that we need to get in there.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, this discussion will really give me the opportunity now to talk a little bit about treatments, and then as you are underlining, or the three of you, how early intervention it's important. And then Caroline mentioned that we need to act when the brain is plastic. This is really fundamental. So the treatments that are now available for Fragile X, they don't cure the disease. This is a message that has to go through with the audience that are listening to the podcast. There are no treatments for Fragile X. The treatments that are available are only symptomatic. So it's mainly, anxiolytic drugs, some antidepressants that are used. When patients, especially at the beginning, in their childhood, they have, epileptic seizures, then it's anti-epileptic drugs. But there is no drug that cure the disease, because the only drugs that we believe can cure the disease are the so-called disease-modifying drugs, which means that the disease has to be modified and has to be rescued. Essentially, the brain, which is altered, has to be rescued to a normal brain. And to add a positive note on that, is that the awareness in pharmaceutical companies on Fragile X is very much improved at the moment. It's very much increased. And we have been talking with many pharma companies, and they have in their portfolio strategies to explore potential disease-modifying therapies, and we're also working on some of those. So I'd say that the approach of the pharma companies is different. They are looking into Fragile X. They're also looking into talking with patients, and really are exploring new therapies that do act on the brain to, let's say, rewire the correct connections, which means to act on what we call synaptic plasticity. So this is happening, and this I think it is a positive note. But stress again, those therapies will only be effective if there is an early intervention. So that research has to go into the direction of both, has to be a parallel research for both the disease modifying drug and trying to find a biomarker that can identify early the disorder.
Yeah, I might just follow on that, Max. When we were out meeting pharma companies, and also when you look at the literature, there's the research was really focused around the seizure aspect of Fragile X, which isn't a predominant feature. It only happens in a small number of patients, but there seemed to be a real major focus on this in the earlier days, trying to find a treatment for Fragile X. But with more awareness and more education, we've kind of moved much further away from that, and we can understand that the biology obviously contributes to this as well. And John mentioned the neurodevelopmental window. There is a time when interventions, whether it's medical or physical or therapy, there's a key moment to really to focus in on that when the brain is in its most plastic state, and where you can really help to maybe open it up, and the therapies can have the most beneficial effects. And it's really through awareness, through interacting with the families, that we can, learn more about the diseases, so that we can target therapies towards this. I mean, one of the projects that we have ongoing is with Fabiana, and she is, which is focused around trying to develop interventions for speech and language, because communication is often a problem for Fragile X kids. So maybe if Fabiana, that might be a good time for you to say a few words on what you're doing.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Charlotte. So, my project is an interdisciplinary research putting together humanities and neuroscience. And I'll try to explain why we think it would be important in order to help families. So, the main aim is to develop possible strategies to treat language difficulties, both in Fragile X syndrome and possibly maybe in other neurodevelopmental disorders. In fact, Fragile X syndrome is associated with different degrees of intellectual disability, and although, as you mentioned before, individual differences are large, most individuals with FXS display weaknesses across all language and literacy domains compared to peers of the same chronological age. So, expressive, receptive, and pragmatic language abilities, as well as literacy skills, are similar to those of younger, typically developing peers. Therefore, it would be of considerable importance to find more effective interventions given the prevalence of language impairment in Fragile X syndrome, and given the impact that communication deficits can have on quality of life and educational achievement, for example. So the question is, what can we do to help them? First of all, try to understand the mechanism involved in their language growth. A number of studies have focused mostly on documenting Fragile X syndrome language profile or on the high degree of within syndrome variability, but only few of them really attempted to find possible interventions to improve their language abilities. Only few years ago, for the first time, some researchers identified alteration in phonological memory as one of the key predictors of linguistic outcomes in Fragile X syndrome. And this finding, it's crucial for our research because once we find possible factors contributing to their atypical language growth, there we can find effective interventions. Phonological memory, in fact, is very important for language development, and it is considered actually a language learning device rather than a simple mechanism for the memorization of familiar words. In fact, it is involved in the storage of unfamiliar sound patterns of word until a more stable long-term representation can be established. Hence, it is not just a simple mechanism for the memorization of familiar words. Consequently, an impaired phonological memory may constitute a critical cognitive risk factor for language impairments. This finding led us to the hypothesis that we could use different strategies to help Fragile X syndrome individuals learning new words. For example, we thought that using visual code in a familiar word learning could be adopted to compensate for poor phonological memory. And our idea is to adapt to Fragile X teenagers, an experiment made few years ago on neurotypical adults to Fragile X syndrome. In this experiment, the researchers explored the potential for visual code in unfamiliar word learning, and they verified that under certain conditions, an artificial induced association between a known word and a visual image was sufficient to compensate for poor phonological memory. So that's what we aim to do. So try to adapt in the experiment to Fragile X syndrome, because learning new vocabulary is crucial to intellectual development in general. So try to identify the cognitive processes involved in acquiring new words is of major importance for us. But above all, we think that finding alternative ways and effective interventions to help Fragile X individuals could help families in an immediate future, because we could help them improve their communicative abilities in general.
Can I add
Sure.
just something to
Yeah,
add
sure.
with language?
Yeah.
Before we focus on language development, you have to support individuals with sensory processing difficulties, because language will not be acquired or developed until the sensory issues are dealt with first. They're so overwhelming, the sensory processing deficits of individuals with Fragile X, that language and then you have to consider that autism plays a factor too as well. So there's language is complicated, and the development of it, like if your whole neuro systems need to be in a relaxed state to develop language. It's not going to happen if your sensory systems are completely out of whack.
Yeah, but you see, Maria, the idea for us was actually to take advantage of this hypersensitive system of the patients to try to use visual coding for learning words. So we were trying, and it's all very exploratory. So
Sure.
maybe our ideas were not completely clear at the moment, but we were trying to actually take advantage of that rather than consider it like something that will not help them, but trying to use the good, if possible, of that, to use it at their advantage to learn new words by visual coding, which they may receive better.
Individuals with Fragile X do very well with visual memory, and their imitation skills are quite high. So their good skills that they have, their memory and imitation with regard to language, but back to it won't happen if their sensory difficulties aren't addressed first. They can't learn. And what I'm trying to say is that they can't learn until they're in that, like us all, unless we're in a relaxed state, because their nervous systems are so wired that they're in that hyper aroused state, which is that fear, fight, or flight mode. That's the way their nervous systems are wired. That's their baseline, if you like. Whereas we neurotypicals, or the average person, we get like that when we get excited. They're wired like that naturally. So then what we try to do is like to try and make sure that we can get them, to their base. It's a bit complicated with them.
We understand that. So
Yeah.
it was our idea. It is our idea that those kind of studies will be done at home.
Yeah. Okay. The environment is important.
Yeah. We also have another project which is mainly centered on what we were talking about, and it's centered about working in pharmaceutical companies on disease-modifying therapies. And this is by using animal models, which are still of great help in drug discovery. And John is actually the director for those studies, so you may want to say a few words about that.
Thanks, Max. We have a project in collaboration with one of our colleagues here in Trinity, Dr. Matt Campbell, in the Smurfit Institute of Genetics, where we'll be looking at a mouse model of Fragile X syndrome. We will talk in more detail about it next time, but basically we were going to use this model to look at some of the basic biology underpinning the disorder. And we're going to take a more open perspective to looking at this model, because generally mouse models, people do the same kind of 5 or 6 behavioral tests. They do the same kind of few measurements, and then they see if their drug works in it or not, and then they move on. We believe that perhaps, we really need to consider the mouse model from some new perspectives, taking into account what we know from patients, take into account what we know from day-to-day behavior in Fragile X patients, and reapply ourselves to understanding the mouse model better, and to determine whether this one that is actually quite widely used is the best one to use, or can we do better. But hopefully we will get some understanding of the gene's normal function and how it's perturbed in the disorder, even if the mouse model itself might not be the most appropriate for that. It's a very exciting project. We're very happy to be doing it, and we're doing it in collaboration with Future Neuro in North CSI, who are the Science Foundation Ireland Centre for Excellence for Neuroscience research in Ireland. So it's hopefully the beginning of a very fruitful and long-lasting work on Fragile X syndrome between ourselves and Future Neuro.
So thank you very much for listening to our podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to subscribe to our channel on whichever platform you're using at the moment, and stay tuned for future episodes. In particular, the next episode is going to be a second part on the Fragile X syndrome, and we're going to have Dr. Matthew Campbell from the Smurfit Institute of Genetics talking more about the science aspect of it and our mutual projects. And we're also going to have a special podcast in Italian about COVID-19 and the impact it's having in Italy and in the world, and a few scientific clues about it as well. So stay tuned, and thank you everyone for participating.
Thank you.
Grazie.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks, Maria.
Bye.
Thank you.